There I stood, frozen in Dorothy's bedroom doorway, my trembling hand clutching a pair of reading glasses that didn't belong to her. The familiar black frames, the tiny scratch on the left temple that Harold had gotten from dropping them in the garage last winter. These were unmistakably my husband's glasses. My heart hammered against my ribcage like a caged bird desperate to escape. The afternoon sunlight streaming through Dorothy's lace curtains felt suddenly harsh, illuminating dust particles that danced mockingly in the air around me. I had come here to water her plants while she was visiting her sister in Portland, just as we'd done for each other countless times over our 30-year friendship. But Harold's glasses, what were they doing on Dorothy's nightstand nestled between her jewelry box and that romance novel she'd been reading? My legs felt like they might give out beneath me. 75 years on this earth, and I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I thought I understood the weight of secrets and the sting of deception. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for this moment. The glasses seemed to stare back at me accusingly, as if they held all the answers to questions I wasn't sure I was brave enough to ask. My mind raced through 1,000 explanations, each one more desperate than the last. Maybe Harold had dropped by to fix something. Maybe Dorothy had found them somewhere and forgotten to mention it. Maybe. But deep in my chest, where a wife's intuition lives and breathes, I already knew the truth. And that truth was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about the two people I trusted most in this world. I slipped the glasses into my coat pocket, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them twice. As I locked Dorothy's front door behind me, one thought echoed in my mind. After 47 years of marriage and 3 decades of friendship, how do you begin to process a betrayal this profound? Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test every fiber of my being. To understand the devastation of that moment, you need to know what came before. The beautiful, trusting world that existed until I found those glasses. Harold and I met in 1978 at a church social. I was 28, he was 31, both of us convinced we'd missed our chance at love. But when he asked me to dance to The Way You Look Tonight, I knew my waiting days were over. We married 8 months later in a simple ceremony that Dorothy helped me plan, her steady presence already becoming the third pillar in what would become our little family. Dorothy moved to our neighborhood in 1994, a recent widow looking for a fresh start. She was vivacious where I was reserved, spontaneous where I was cautious. We balanced each other perfectly. She dragged me to pottery classes and book clubs, while I'd ground her with practical advice and home-cooked meals when her wild adventures went awry. Harold adored her from the start. "That woman's got enough energy to power the whole block," he'd say with a chuckle, watching Dorothy chase her cat around her backyard in her nightgown at 7 in the morning. The three of us became inseparable: holiday dinners, weekend trips to the coast, countless evenings playing cards on our back porch while the cicadas sang their summer songs. Dorothy never remarried after losing her husband Tom, though she had her share of gentleman callers over the years. "I'm too set in my ways," she'd laugh when Harold and I would tease her about the florist who brought her roses every Friday. "Besides, why would I need a man when I've got you two taking such good care of me?" Harold was the kind of husband who still brought me coffee in bed after 4 decades of marriage. He'd leave little notes in my purse, "Have a beautiful day, my beautiful wife," and never failed to hold my hand during our evening walks around the neighborhood. Even at 78, he was my steady rock, my safe harbor in every storm. Our friendship with Dorothy was woven through every important moment of our lives. She held my hand during my gallbladder surgery, Harold fixed her leaky faucets and mowed her lawn when arthritis made it difficult. We were each other's emergency contacts, each other's chosen family. When Dorothy's sister called last month asking her to come help with their elderly mother, it felt natural that Harold and I would look after her house, water her plants, collect her mail. We'd done it dozens of times before, just as she'd done for us during our anniversary trips and my visits to see my grandchildren in California. Trust was the foundation of everything we built together. Harold trusted me with his heart, his dreams, his fears about growing old. I trusted Dorothy with my deepest secrets, my worries about Harold's occasional forgetfulness, my own anxieties about what the future held. And Dorothy trusted us both with her vulnerabilities, her loneliness, her house keys, and her heart. We were 3 souls who had found each other in this vast, often lonely world, creating a bond that felt unbreakable. We were proof that love comes in many forms: romantic love, friendship love, the chosen family love that sustains us through life's challenges. Or so I believed until I found those glasses and realized that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal. Looking back now, I can see the signs were there, subtle as morning frost, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what to look for. But when you've lived with someone for 47 years, their rhythms become as familiar as your own heartbeat. When those rhythms change, some part of you notices, even if your conscious mind isn't ready to acknowledge what it means. It started about 6 months ago with Harold's sudden interest in afternoon walks. He'd always been a morning exercise person, up at dawn for his constitutional around the neighborhood. But suddenly he developed a need for fresh air around 2 o'clock, right after his afternoon news program ended. "Just feeling restless, sweetheart," he'd say when I'd offer to join him. "You know how I get when I sit too long. These old bones need to keep moving." I didn't think much of it at first. At our age, we all develop new aches and habits. But the walks grew longer, sometimes lasting 2 hours. When I'd ask about his route, his answers became vague. "Oh, the usual places. Down by the park, around the elementary school, just wherever my feet took me." Then came the phone calls. Harold had never been much of a phone person. He'd rather drive across town than have a long conversation over the wire. But suddenly he was taking calls in the kitchen with the door closed, his voice dropping to whispers I couldn't quite make out from the living room. "Who was that, dear?" I'd ask when he'd return, and he'd always have an explanation. His cousin in Nebraska calling about their mother's estate. An old army buddy tracking down addresses for a reunion. The pharmacy confirming his prescription. All reasonable explanations, all delivered with the same loving smile he'd given me for decades. But there were other things. The way he'd suddenly become interested in Dorothy's travel plans, asking detailed questions about when she'd be leaving for Portland, how long she'd be gone, whether she'd changed her mind about the dates. His newfound attention to his appearance, cologne on Tuesday afternoons, his good shirt for grocery runs, extra care with his hair on days when he claimed he wasn't going anywhere special. Dorothy seemed different too, though I attributed it to pre-travel jitters. She'd always been animated, but lately she seemed almost manic. Talking faster, laughing a little too loudly, her eyes not quite meeting mine during our morning coffee visits. When I'd mention Harold, she'd change the subject quickly, asking about my garden or my grandchildren's latest school projects. The most troubling change was in the dynamic between the three of us. Our easy conversation became stilted, punctuated by strange silences and meaningful looks that I couldn't decode. When we'd play cards, Harold and Dorothy would exchange glances that seemed to carry private messages. They'd both reach for snacks at the same time, their hands brushing with what seemed like intentional frequency. I told myself I was imagining things. Jealousy is an ugly emotion, and I'd never considered myself a jealous woman. Harold had female friends throughout our marriage, colleagues and neighbors I genuinely liked. Dorothy had been part of our lives for 3 decades without a single moment of romantic tension that I'd ever noticed. But love and friendship can shift in ways that surprise everyone involved. 2 people who've shared years of conversation and comfort can suddenly see each other through different eyes. Lines that seemed clearly drawn can blur when loneliness and opportunity intersect in just the wrong way. Still, I fought against my suspicions. These were the 2 people I loved most in the world, the anchors of my daily existence. The alternative, that they could betray me, betray us, betray everything we'd built together, was simply too devastating to seriously consider. So I made excuses for the signs I was seeing, explained away the changes, convinced myself that my imagination was getting the better of me. After all, what's the alternative to trust when you're 75 years old and these people are your whole world? I had no idea that my world was already fracturing beneath my feet, one small crack at a time. The morning I found the glasses started like any other Tuesday. Harold left early for his doctor's appointment, a routine checkup he'd been putting off for months. I made myself tea and toast, watered my kitchen herbs, and settled in with a mystery novel Dorothy had recommended. Around 11, I remembered my promise to check on Dorothy's African violets. She'd been worried about leaving them for 2 weeks, fussing over the exact watering schedule like they were newborn babies. I grabbed her spare key from our kitchen drawer and walked the 3 blocks to her house, enjoying the October sunshine and the way the maple leaves crunched under my feet. Dorothy's house always smelled like vanilla candles and the lavender sachets she kept in every closet. I made my way to the sunroom where she kept her prized violets, carefully checking the soil moisture and adding water where needed. The plants looked healthy and vibrant, their purple blooms reaching toward the windows. I was turning to leave when I noticed the bedroom door was slightly ajar. Dorothy was meticulous about closing doors when she traveled, a habit from her years living alone. Concerned that perhaps the latch wasn't catching properly, I walked over to push it fully closed. That's when I saw them. Harold's reading glasses, sitting on Dorothy's nightstand like they belonged there. Like they'd been placed there countless times before. The sight hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making the room spin around me. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, staring at those familiar frames. My mind raced through impossible explanations. Maybe Harold had stopped by to check something and forgotten them. Maybe Dorothy had borrowed them for some reason. Maybe they'd fallen out of his pocket during one of their card games and she'd found them later. But the location told a different story. The nightstand was intimate territory, a place for personal belongings, bedtime necessities, private things. Harold's glasses weren't carelessly dropped or temporarily set aside. They were placed there with the familiarity of routine. With shaking hands I picked them up. They were clean, cared for, positioned next to Dorothy's reading lamp as if Harold regularly needed them in this very spot. My husband's glasses in my best friend's bedroom, where they clearly felt at home. The room suddenly felt suffocating. Dorothy's perfume seemed too strong, the cheerful yellow wallpaper too bright. I noticed other things I'd somehow missed before. A coffee mug on the dresser that matched the set Harold preferred, a book on the floor that I recognized from our own bedside table, an indent in the pillow next to Dorothy's that suggested recent use. My legs gave out and I sank onto Dorothy's vanity chair, still clutching Harold's glasses. 47 years of marriage, 30 years of friendship. How long had this been going on? How many signs had I missed or chosen to ignore? How many times had they sat at our dinner table or played cards in our living room, sharing secret glances and private jokes while I served them coffee and worried about whether Dorothy was eating enough? The betrayal felt like drowning in reverse. Instead of water filling my lungs, it was the absence of everything I'd believed in. The trust, the love, the security I'd built my life around was rushing out of me, leaving me gasping and empty. I thought about Harold's afternoon walks, his mysterious phone calls, his sudden interest in Dorothy's travel plans. I thought about Dorothy's nervous energy, her inability to meet my eyes, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The signs hadn't been subtle. I'd just been too trusting, too comfortable, too convinced of my own security to see them. Sitting in that bedroom, surrounded by evidence of my husband's secret life with my best friend, I felt like I was 75 years old for the first time. Not because of my arthritis or my gray hair or my reading glasses, but because I suddenly understood what it meant to have your world collapse when you're too old to build another one. I slipped Harold's glasses into my coat pocket and walked out of Dorothy's house, locking the door behind me with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped the key. The walk home felt endless, every step carrying me further from the life I'd known and closer to a future I couldn't imagine. By the time I reached our front porch, I had made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But I also wasn't ready to confront what it meant. Not yet. The glasses felt like they were burning a hole in my coat pocket. I transferred them to my jewelry box, tucked behind my grandmother's pearl necklace where Harold would never think to look. But even hidden away they haunted me. I could feel their presence in the house like a malevolent spirit, reminding me every moment that my life was built on lies I'd been too naive to recognize. Harold came home from his doctor's appointment cheerful and chatty, sharing details about his blood pressure readings and the nurse's compliment on his healthy weight. He moved through our kitchen with the same easy familiarity he'd shown for decades, making his afternoon sandwich, asking about my day, mentioning he might take a walk after lunch. I watched him with new eyes, searching for signs of deception in gestures that had once seemed natural and loving. When he kissed my forehead, was he thinking about Dorothy? When he asked about my book, was he buying time to plan his next secret rendezvous? The husband I'd trusted implicitly had become a stranger wearing a familiar face. "You seem quiet today, sweetheart," he said, settling into his recliner with the newspaper. "Everything all right?" "Just tired," I managed, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. It was the first dishonest thing I'd said to Harold in 47 years of marriage, and I hated how easily it came. That night, I lay beside him listening to his peaceful breathing and wondering how he could sleep so soundly while carrying such a terrible secret. Did he feel any guilt about what he was doing? Did he think about me at all when he was with Dorothy, or had I become just an obstacle to navigate around? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, picking at every memory, recoloring every recent interaction. The book Harold had been reading that I'd found in Dorothy's bedroom. When had he taken it there? The coffee mug that matched his preferences. Had he asked for it specifically, or had Dorothy simply learned his tastes through intimate familiarity? Sleep became impossible. I'd drift off for an hour only to wake with a start, my heart racing from dreams where I was chasing Harold and Dorothy through a maze of rooms, always arriving just moments too late to catch them. I'd lie there in the dark, hyper-aware of every sound. Was that Harold getting up for water or sneaking out to meet Dorothy? Was he really asleep beside me, or just pretending while he planned tomorrow's deception? The worst part was the isolation. For 30 years, Dorothy had been my closest confidant, the friend I turned to when life felt overwhelming. And Harold had been my partner in everything, my safe place to process difficult emotions. Now the two people I would normally lean on were the source of my pain, and I was trapped in a prison of my own silence. I couldn't eat. Food turned to ash in my mouth, and my stomach churned with a constant low-level nausea that no amount of ginger tea could settle. Harold noticed my lack of appetite and fussed over me with the same concerned attention he'd always shown, suggesting his mother's chicken soup recipe and asking if I needed to see the doctor. His kindness felt like salt in an open wound. How could he be so attentive to my physical comfort while systematically destroying my emotional world? Was this guilt driving his extra solicitousness, or was he simply that skilled at compartmentalizing his life? By the third sleepless night, I was beginning to understand why people describe heartbreak as a physical ailment. My chest ached constantly, a heavy pressure that made breathing difficult. My hands shook when I tried to hold my coffee cup. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, gaunt, aged by grief in the span of 72 hours. I found myself studying our wedding photos, searching for clues I might have missed about Harold's capacity for deception. Had there been warning signs even then? Was I always just a placeholder until something better came along, or had his feelings genuinely changed over the years? The uncertainty was perhaps worse than the betrayal itself. If I could understand when and why this had started, maybe I could find a way forward. But without confrontation, without answers, I was left to imagine the worst possible scenarios. That Harold had never really loved me, that Dorothy had been planning this betrayal for years, that everyone in our social circle knew and pitied me. I called in sick to my volunteer shift at the library, claiming a stomach bug. I canceled lunch with my sister, postponed my hair appointment, avoided the grocery store where I might run into neighbors who would ask why I looked so terrible. Our house became both my fortress and my prison, the only place I felt safe from questions I couldn't answer and conversations I couldn't bear to have. Harold suggested I see our family doctor, worried about my sudden decline. The irony wasn't lost on me, the man causing my illness offering to help cure it. But I couldn't explain my symptoms without revealing their source, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. But I was beginning to realize that my silence had an expiration date, and it was approaching faster than I wanted to admit. By Saturday morning, I knew I couldn't continue living in limbo. The weight of what I knew was crushing me, and Harold's concerned attention was becoming unbearable. When he suggested we take a drive to see the fall foliage, one of our favorite autumn traditions, something inside me finally snapped. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Sit down, Harold." He looked startled by my tone. In 47 years, I'd rarely used that serious, no-nonsense voice with him. He settled into his usual chair, his eyes showing the first hint of wariness I'd seen since I'd found the glasses. I went to our bedroom and retrieved them from my jewelry box, my hands surprisingly steady now that the moment had finally arrived. When I returned to the living room, Harold's face went completely white. "I found these at Dorothy's house," I said simply, placing them on the coffee table between us. On her nightstand, next to her bed. The silence that followed was deafening. Harold stared at the glasses like they might disappear if he looked hard enough. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. In that moment, his expression told me everything I needed to know. There would be no innocent explanation, no misunderstanding to clear up. "How long?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Harold's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his secret had been physically holding him up. Margaret, I never meant for this to happen. How long, Harold? He looked up at me then and I saw tears in his eyes. 8 months. Maybe 9. It's hard to say when friendship became something else. 8 months. Almost the entire time Dorothy had been planning her trip to Portland. The mysterious phone calls, the afternoon walks, the strange tension in our threesome. It had all been leading to this moment when their secret would finally come to light. Do you love her? The question escaped before I could stop it, and I immediately wished I could take it back. Some answers are too devastating to hear. Harold was quiet for so long I thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I love you both. I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth. What happened with Dorothy, it doesn't diminish what we have, Margaret. It never has. The casual way he said it, as if loving 2 women simultaneously was just another life circumstance to navigate, stunned me into silence. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. This was a man who had consciously chosen to build a second life with my best friend while maintaining the facade of our marriage. Does she love you? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She says she does. Harold's honesty was brutal. But she loves you too, Margaret. This is tearing her apart. Both of us, actually. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. They were torn apart by their betrayal of me while I was being destroyed by it. The disparity in our suffering would have been comedic if it weren't so tragic. Where? I asked. When I think I know where you are, where are you really? Her house mostly. Sometimes the park when the weather's nice. A few times we drove to the coast. Each location was a dagger in my chest, places I'd been with both of them, spaces that had felt safe and familiar and were now contaminated by their deception. The afternoon walks, I said, and Harold nodded miserably. The phone calls. All those times you said you were going to the hardware store or the pharmacy. I wanted to tell you, he said, and for the first time in our conversation, I heard something that might have been genuine regret. Every day I wanted to tell you. But how do you explain something like this? How do you tell your wife of 47 years that you've fallen in love with her best friend? You don't, I said quietly. You choose. You choose your wife, or you choose your wife's best friend, or you choose to be honest about choosing neither. What you don't do is choose both while lying to everyone involved. Harold flinched at my words but didn't argue with them. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 47 years of marriage settling around us like dust after an explosion. Everything we'd built together, the trust, the partnership, the shared future we'd planned, lay in ruins between us. What happens now? He asked finally. It was the question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. At 75, starting over felt impossible. But staying felt equally impossible when the foundation of our life together had crumbled so completely. I don't know, I answered honestly. I truly don't know. The days following our confrontation passed in a strange, suspended state. Harold moved his things to the guest bedroom without being asked, as if he understood that sharing our marital bed was no longer possible. We were polite to each other, passing coffee and newspaper sections, asking about doctor's appointments and grocery lists. But the easy intimacy of decades had evaporated overnight. Dorothy returned from Portland on a Thursday, and I watched from my kitchen window as Harold walked over to her house that afternoon. They stood in her driveway talking for nearly an hour, their body language animated and urgent. I didn't need to hear their conversation to know they were discussing what came next, how to navigate the wreckage of what they'd created. That evening, Dorothy called me. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confident vivacity that had always defined her. Margaret, could I come over? I think we need to talk. Part of me wanted to hang up the phone, to preserve what little dignity I had left by refusing to engage. But another part, the part that had loved this woman like a sister for 30 years, needed to hear what she had to say. She arrived 20 minutes later, her usual perfect appearance disheveled. Her hands shook as she sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of cups of coffee and conversations over the decades. I never meant for this to happen, she began, echoing Harold's words from days earlier. You have to believe that, Margaret. I never set out to hurt you. But you did hurt me, I replied quietly. Whether you meant to or not, you did. Dorothy's composure crumbled then, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find words. I know. Oh God, I know. I've been sick about it for months, wondering how to tell you, wondering if I should just disappear from both your lives rather than destroy everything we've built. Why didn't you? I asked. Why didn't you just leave? Because I'm selfish, she said with brutal honesty. Because I love Harold and I love you and I couldn't bear to give up either relationship. I convinced myself that what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you, that I could compartmentalize these feelings and everything would somehow work out. I studied her face, searching for signs of the woman I'd considered my dearest friend. She was still there but changed, marked by guilt and secret-keeping in ways that made her seem like a stranger. Do you understand what you've taken from me? I asked. Not just Harold, though that's devastating enough. But you've taken my ability to trust my own instincts, my faith in the people I love most, my sense of security in my own home. You've made me doubt everything I thought I knew about my life. Dorothy's tears came harder then, and I felt a surprising absence of satisfaction in her pain. 30 years of friendship don't disappear overnight, even under these circumstances. I know I have no right to ask, she whispered, but is there any possibility of forgiveness? Any chance we could find our way back to some kind of relationship? The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Forgiveness felt impossible in that moment, but so did the alternative, losing both Harold and Dorothy simultaneously, becoming truly alone at an age when making new connections felt overwhelming. I don't know, I said honestly. I can't imagine trusting either of you again. But I also can't imagine my life without both of you in it. I'm 75 years old, Dorothy. This is supposed to be the time when life gets simpler, not when everything falls apart. We talked for another hour, dancing around the impossible logistics of what came next. Could Harold and I repair our marriage? Could Dorothy and I salvage our friendship? Could the three of us find some new configuration that honored everyone's feelings without destroying what remained of our connections? There were no easy answers, no clear path forward. But as I watched Dorothy walk back to her house that night, I realized I'd made one important decision. I wasn't going to let their betrayal turn me into someone bitter and broken. I'd spent 75 years becoming the woman I was: strong, compassionate, resilient. I wasn't going to let this destroy the essential parts of myself that had nothing to do with Harold or Dorothy. Whatever came next, I would face it with dignity and grace, not because they deserved it, but because I did. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not because I'd decided on divorce, but because I needed to understand my options. I called my sister and asked if I could visit for a few weeks, needing space and perspective away from the epicenter of my changed world. Most importantly, I began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding my sense of self from the ground up. The Margaret who had defined herself primarily as Harold's wife and Dorothy's friend was gone. In her place, I would create someone new, someone who could stand alone if necessary, but who remained open to love and friendship when they came without deception. It would be the hardest work of my life, but it was work that would ultimately save me. 6 months have passed since I found those glasses, and I'm writing this story from my sister's guest room in Phoenix, where the desert sunrise reminds me daily that beautiful things can grow in the harshest conditions. The distance has given me perspective I couldn't find at home, surrounded by the ghosts of my old life. Harold and I are separated, though not divorced. We speak once a week, careful conversations about practical matters. The house, our finances, his health. He's still living in our home, still seeing Dorothy, though he tells me their relationship has changed under the weight of what it cost. Some secrets, once exposed, lose their power to sustain the very things they were meant to protect. Dorothy writes me letters, actual handwritten letters, as if email would be too presumptuous. She updates me on neighborhood news, asks about my health, never mentions Harold directly but writes around the Harold-shaped hole in our friendship with careful politeness. I read them all but haven't responded. I'm not punishing her. I simply don't know what to say yet. The hardest part of this journey has been learning to trust myself again. For months, I second-guessed every instinct, every relationship, every moment of happiness. If I could miss such a fundamental betrayal in my own life, what else was I failing to see? The answer I've learned is probably nothing. Sometimes good people make terrible choices, and sometimes those choices blindside the people who love them most. My granddaughter visited last month, full of college stories and career dreams. As I listened to her describe her fears about the future, her worries about making the right choices, I found myself sharing something I never expected to say. Sweetheart, you can't protect yourself from betrayal by loving less or trusting less. You can only protect yourself by knowing who you are when everything else falls away. At 75, I'm learning who that person is. She's someone who can sit with uncertainty without being destroyed by it. She's someone who can acknowledge that love is complicated and imperfect without becoming cynical about its possibilities. She's someone who can be hurt deeply and still choose compassion over revenge. I don't know what my future holds. I may return home and attempt to rebuild my marriage on different terms. I may stay here in the desert and build an entirely new life. I may find a third option I can't imagine yet. What I do know is that I'm no longer afraid of any of these possibilities. The woman who found those glasses 6 months ago was devastated by the discovery that her life wasn't what she thought it was. The woman writing this story understands that life rarely is what we think it is, and that's not necessarily a tragedy. Sometimes it's just the truth, waiting patiently for us to be brave enough to see it clearly. People often ask if I regret finding the glasses, if I wish I'd remained ignorant of Harold and Dorothy's relationship. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain, the shattered trust, the loneliness that followed. But I don't regret the truth. Living a lie, even a comfortable lie, isn't really living at all. There's a cactus outside my window that blooms spectacular pink flowers for just a few days each year. The rest of the time it looks like nothing special, just another thorny desert plant surviving in impossible conditions. But when those blooms appear, they're so beautiful they take your breath away. I've learned that resilience often looks like that cactus, unremarkable most of the time, but capable of creating something extraordinary when circumstances demand it. I'm 75 years old and I am blooming. Not despite what happened to me, but because of how I chose to respond to what happened to me. That's the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. Not what happens to you, but what you decide to do with what happens to you. Sometimes, the deepest cuts are made without a single word by people who claim to love us while systematically undermining the foundations of our security. And sometimes the only way to survive those cuts is to close the wound yourself, not with bitterness or hatred, but with the gentle medicine of self-compassion and the radical act of choosing to keep your heart open to whatever comes next. This is my story of betrayal, but more importantly, it's my story of survival. And if you're reading this because you've found your own version of those glasses, I want you to know that survival is possible. Healing is possible. Finding yourself again is possible. Trust me. I'm 75 years old and I'm proof that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be all along.